They called it Flame City, a hellish, tangled landscape of black volcanic ash, jagged rock, and concrete on the western coast of a tiny, 8-square-mile island in the Pacific, Iwo Jima. February 1945. For the men of the 5th Marine Division, every yard forward was paid for in blood against a fanatical, invisible enemy burrowed deep within the very earth. The Japanese defensive doctrine was simple: let the Americans land, then slaughter them from impregnable, interlocking positions. For the infantryman advancing through this meat grinder, the sight of yet another reinforced bunker, its slitted aperture spewing machine gun fire, was a vision of pure despair. Standard weapons were useless. Artillery merely churned the ash. The only answer was to get dangerously close and pour searing, liquid death directly into the enemy's murder hole. This was the brutal, intimate task of the flamethrower operator. And on the morning of February 26, 1945, one Marine, a 22-year-old former oil field worker from West Virginia, stepped into this nightmare armed with a 2-man weapon. His name was Corporal Herschel W. Woody Williams of the 21st Marines, 3rd Battalion. For 30 nightmarish minutes, he would wage a solitary war against the very heart of the Japanese defense. With a 70-pound tank of jelly gasoline on his back and a torrent of fire at his fingertips, he would advance where no one else could. The Japanese soldiers in their labyrinth of steel and concrete had prepared for everything: artillery barrages, infantry charges, grenades. But they could not stop this Marine. Not until 16 of their fortresses had been reduced to smoldering tombs. This is the story of impossible courage, a lone figure against an entrenched army, and the 30 minutes that changed the battle for Iwo Jima. To understand the sheer magnitude of Corporal Williams' actions, one must first understand the battlefield. Iwo Jima, meaning Sulphur Island, was a strategic imperative for the United States. Its 2 airfields, once captured, would provide a critical emergency landing strip for crippled B-29 superfortresses bombing Japan, and a base for fighter escorts. But the Japanese, under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had transformed the island into the most formidable fortress of the Pacific War. For months, they had honeycombed the entire island with a network of over 11 miles of tunnels, connecting more than 1,500 bunkers, pillboxes, and blockhouses. The terrain was a defender's paradise. Soft, black volcanic ash that swallowed men and vehicles whole, and a ragged plateau known as Mount Suribachi dominating the southern tip. The American plan called for the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions to land on the eastern beaches and drive north, while the 3rd Marine Division waited in reserve. The landing on February 19, 1945, was met not with a furious banzai charge, but with eerie silence. Then, as the beaches congested with men and equipment, all hell broke loose. Pre-registered artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire rained down from hidden positions, turning the black sand into a charnel house. The Marines' advance inland was measured in feet, not yards, against a foe they could scarcely see. Into this cauldron was thrust the 21st Marine Regiment of the 3rd Marine Division. Among them was CPL Herschel Williams, a man who seemed almost destined for the weapon he would wield. Growing up on a farm in Quiet Dell, West Virginia, he was no stranger to hard labor, having worked in the state's oil and gas fields. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1943, following the death of his 2 brothers in the war. He was initially trained as a demolition man and flamethrower operator, 2 of the most dangerous and psychologically taxing specialties in the infantry. The M22 flamethrower he carried was not a one-man weapon. In theory, it required a 2-man team. The operator, who carried the twin fuel and compressed air tanks and wielded the firing gun, and an assistant, who carried extra fuel and provided covering fire with a rifle. In the chaos of Iwo Jima, theory often disintegrated. The weapon itself was a terrifying device. The fuel was napalm, a thickening agent mixed with gasoline that created a sticky, burning gel. A burst of compressed nitrogen propelled the flaming liquid up to 40 yards. The operator was a walking bomb, a towering target for every enemy rifleman and sniper. To use it, you had to get within spitting distance of a fortified position, often while under direct fire. Survival rates for flamethrower operators were notoriously low. Williams, a quiet, deeply religious man, carried this burden as his company fought its way inland, facing what seemed like an endless series of reinforced concrete pillboxes that halted the entire battalion's advance. The strategic situation was a deadlock. The Marines were pinned down on an ash plain, and the intricate Japanese defensive system seemed unbeatable. Something had to give. On the fourth day of the battle, February 21st, Williams Company Commander, 1st Lieutenant John M.C. Cloud, was killed. The following days were a blur of attrition, as the 21st Marines inched forward at a horrific cost. By February 26th, they were facing a specific, lethal complex of fortifications that had completely stymied the advance. The date was February 26, 1945, D+7 on Iwo Jima. For Corporal Williams and the men of Company C, 1st Battalion, 21st Marines, the battle had settled into a grim, exhausting rhythm of attack, repel, and consolidate under constant fire. The objective was a patch of ground just south of Airfield No. 2, but between them and that ground lay a nightmarish defensive web the Marines had dubbed the meat grinder. This particular sector was dominated not by a single large fortification, but by a sprawling network of reinforced concrete pillboxes. These were not simple foxholes. They were low-slung, dome-shaped structures, several feet thick, with steel-reinforced apertures just wide enough for a machine gun or anti-tank cannon to sweep the approach. They were mutually supporting, meaning the field of fire from one bunker covered the blind spots of its neighbors. Attacking one meant exposing your flank to another. The ground was the ubiquitous soft, black ash, making rapid movement impossible and offering no cover. The weather was typically bleak. Overcast skies, a sharp, salty wind blowing from the sea, and a fine, choking dust that coated everything. The morning attack had begun with the usual preparation, a thunderous naval bombardment and artillery barrage that shook the island. From their lines, the Marines watched shells and rockets slam into the Japanese positions, throwing plumes of black earth and smoke into the air. But experience had taught them a bitter lesson. As soon as the bombardment lifted and the infantry began to advance, the hidden machine guns would sputter back to life, and the deadly game would resume. This morning was no different. At 0830 hours, the order came down the line. Move out. The men of Company C rose from their shallow scrapes in the ash and began the slow, painful advance. Almost immediately, the air was torn by the distinctive tot-tot-tot of Nambu Type 92 heavy machine guns and the sharper crack of Arsaka rifles. Incoming mortar rounds began to walk through the advancing lines, the explosions muffled by the soft ground, but no less deadly. Men dove for cover that didn't exist, pressing their bodies into the fine black powder. The lead platoons had advanced barely 150 yards when the entire company was savagely pinned down. Fire was coming from multiple directions, but the primary source was a line of at least a dozen concrete pillboxes, cleverly sited along a low rise. From their positions, Japanese gunners had a perfect, unobstructed field of fire over the entire approach. Every time a Marine tried to move, a burst of fire would kick up the ash at his feet or strike the man next to him. The company's own machine guns and riflemen tried to provide suppressing fire, but their rounds simply ricocheted off the thick concrete with a futile spang. Grenades were useless. They couldn't be thrown accurately into the small firing ports from a distance. Bazooka teams tried to crawl forward, but the operators were immediately targeted, and the rocket-shaped charge often failed to penetrate the heavy fortifications. The advance had ground to a bloody, complete halt. Casualties began to mount. Corpsmen scrambled from man to man under the withering fire, their Red Cross markings offering no protection. For over 2 hours, the stalemate continued. The company commander, now Captain Thomas A.M.C. Combs, radioed for more artillery support. Another barrage crashed down, momentarily silencing the Japanese guns. The moment it stopped, the Marines tried to rush forward again, and, as if on a macabre timer, the Nambu machine guns roared back to life, cutting down the point men. It was a demoralizing cycle of hope and devastation. The battalion's momentum was dying in this ash field. Morale, already tested by a week of horrific combat, began to fray. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the stomach of every man. But with it came a simmering frustration, a desperate anger at these invisible, implacable fortifications. They were being held hostage by concrete and steel. It was in this cauldron of stalled momentum and rising desperation that First Lieutenant John Jake H.G.H., a composite figure representing the command element, sought a solution. He gathered his non-commissioned officers and specialists. "We have to silence those pillboxes," he stated, his voice gravelly with fatigue and ash. "Conventional assault isn't working. We need demolition and flamethrowers." All eyes turned to the demolition men, and among them, Corporal Herschel Williams. Williams listened, his face streaked with sweat and grime. He knew what this meant. The flamethrower was the only tool that could reach inside those murder holes and kill the occupants without destroying the structure itself, a necessity, as the Marines would eventually use these captured bunkers for their own defense. But to use it, he would have to walk, not run, across nearly 200 yards of open, fire-swept ground, directly toward the muzzles of the guns that had just slaughtered his comrades. There would be no element of surprise. The Japanese gunners would see him coming, a lone, slow-moving figure with a bulky, unmistakable silhouette. It was, in every sense, a suicide mission. Lieutenant H asked for volunteers. There was a heavy silence. Then, Williams spoke up. His voice was quiet but firm, carrying the faint trace of a West Virginia accent. "I'll go, sir." He did not boast. He did not make a speech. It was a simple statement of duty. His assistant, Private First Class James O. Ollie K., a representative figure, nodded grimly beside him, hefting his rifle and extra fuel cans. Their task was clear: advance under the covering fire of every available weapon in the company and systematically neutralize the pillbox network. The time was approximately 1,030 hours. The fate of the company's advance, and potentially the entire battalion's flank, now rested on the shoulders of one 22-year-old corporal and his terrifying weapon. The plan was deceptively simple in concept, hellishly complex in execution. 4 riflemen would provide direct, close and covering fire for Williams and his assistant, doing their best to keep the Japanese gunners' heads down. The rest of the company would lay down a furious base of fire with every Browning automatic rifle, M1 Garand, and machine gun they had, aiming at the pillbox apertures. It was a desperate gamble, hoping sheer volume of fire could provide a few precious seconds of suppression. Williams checked his equipment for what felt like the 100th time. The weight of the fuel and pressure tanks was a familiar burden, but now it felt like the weight of the world. He gripped the firing gun, a long tube with a trigger mechanism and a pilot light at the nozzle. He signaled he was ready. At the lieutenant's signal, the company opened up. The noise was deafening, a continuous, roaring cacophony of American .30-06 and .30 caliber fire. Tracers streaked toward the Japanese positions, sparking off the concrete. For a moment, the Japanese fire seemed to slacken, confused by the sudden intensity. This was the window. Go. Go now. Williams, with his assistant and the 4 riflemen, broke from cover and began the long, slow trek across the open ground. The ash was their enemy as much as the Japanese. Each step was a laborious sink and pull, like walking through deep snow. They could not run. They could only trudge, making them agonizingly slow targets. Almost immediately, Japanese fire resumed. Bullets snapped past them, kicking up little geysers of black dust at their feet. One of the covering riflemen cried out and went down, clutching his leg. The others dragged him to a shallow depression and kept firing. Williams kept moving, his eyes locked on the nearest pillbox, a squat, menacing silhouette about 50 yards ahead. He could see the dark slit of its firing port. He felt utterly exposed, a giant on an empty stage. Fear was a physical force, tightening his chest and making his hands tremble on the flamethrower's grips. He pushed it down, focusing on the mechanics of his movement. One foot, then the other. Breathe. Keep the nozzle up. He reached the first pillbox. His covering team laid down a blistering fire at the aperture. Williams, moving with a calm that belied the storm around him, approached from the flank. He had to get close. 20 feet. 15. He could smell the acrid cordite from the Japanese gun. He leveled the nozzle, pulled the trigger for the pilot light, and then squeezed the main trigger. With a deep whoosh, a narrow, focused stream of orange-yellow flame, thick with black smoke, shot from the gun. It was not a massive fireball but a lance of liquid fire. He walked the stream directly into the firing slit. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The flame filled the interior space. He heard muffled screams from within, saw secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off. The machine gun fell silent. The pillbox was dead, but the act had drawn the concentrated attention of every adjacent position. He was now the primary target. What followed was a 30-minute solo ballet of death, a staggering display of raw courage and tactical ingenuity. There was no time for relief, no moment to savor a success. As soon as one pillbox was silenced, fire from the next in line intensified. Williams became a magnet for bullets. He moved in short, desperate rushes, sometimes crawling on his belly through the ash, dragging the heavy flamethrower beside him. His assistant, PFCK, was a hero in his own right, constantly moving with him, providing rifle fire, and, at one critical moment, saving Williams' life by shooting a Japanese soldier who had leapt from a spider hole with a grenade just 10 yards away. The process was repeated again and again, but each engagement was uniquely perilous. One pillbox was connected to a trench line. As Williams approached, a squad of Japanese infantry charged out, bayonets fixed. His covering riflemen cut them down in a frantic, close-range firefight. Williams then had to flame not only the pillbox but the trench, searing its length to prevent another counterattack. At another position, the aperture was unusually small. Williams had to get within 10 feet, kneeling in the open as bullets chipped the concrete around him, to angle the stream perfectly inside. The heat from his own weapon was blistering, singeing his eyebrows and forearms. The smell of burned gasoline, cooked flesh, and cordite created a nauseating pall. The climax of the crisis came as he targeted a particularly large, central pillbox that seemed to be a command post. It was the linchpin of the sector. Fire from this position was especially heavy, and it had clear lines of sight to all the others he had already neutralized. The covering fire from his company was losing its effectiveness. Ammunition was running low, and the sustained rate of fire was causing weapons to overheat and jam. Williams and his tiny team were increasingly isolated. As he prepared to make his final approach, a Japanese knee mortar round landed just behind him. The explosion threw him forward, showering him with ash and debris. Stunned, ears ringing, he checked himself for wounds. Miraculously, he was intact, but his flamethrower hose was punctured, a fine spray of fuel misting into the air. One stray spark, and he would be immolated. This was the moment of maximum despair. The weapon was compromised. He was in the open, closer to the enemy than to his own lines. The mission seemed doomed. But shutting down the valve on the damaged hose, he signaled to his assistant. Together, under continuous fire, they performed a battlefield repair, using a strip of adhesive tape from a first aid kit to bind the leak, knowing it was a temporary, terrifying fix. With the weapon patched but volatile, Williams knew he had one chance. He stood up and charged the last few yards to the central pillbox, ignoring the bullet smacking into the ash around him. He fired a long, sustained burst of flame directly into the main aperture, then swept the nozzle across the ventilation pipes he spotted on top. The interior became an inferno. Secondary explosions rocked the structure, and then, finally, silence. The silence that followed the destruction of the central pillbox was profound, but it was not the silence of conclusion. It was the tense, breathless quiet of a battlefield holding its breath. Corporal Williams, slumped against the still-hot concrete of the ruined bunker, was spent. His arms shook from the strain of carrying and aiming the heavy weapon. His face was blackened with soot and ash, his uniform smoldering in places. The immediate, murderous fire from the complex had ceased, but he knew the labyrinth likely still held enemy soldiers in deeper tunnels and connected spider holes. He was now deep in what had been, just minutes before, the heart of the Japanese defensive position. His small team was down to 3 men, including his assistant. They were low on ammunition, and Williams' flamethrower was critically low on fuel. The jury-rigged hose repair seeping ominously. This was the turning point. Not a single dramatic event, but a critical consolidation of breathtaking gains. Williams' solitary, brutal work had not just destroyed physical structures. It had shattered a segment of the Japanese defensive wall, and, more importantly, had physically carved a path through what was considered an impregnable barrier. The immediate, cataclysmic threat was gone, but the opportunity had to be seized instantly, or the Japanese would reinforce from their tunnel networks. From his position, Williams could now see the broader layout of the field. He identified several smaller, reinforcing positions that had been shielded by the main pillboxes, covered rifle pits and mortar emplacements that had been parring flanking fire into the Marine advance. He signaled back to the company line, now about 150 yards behind him. Seeing Williams standing among the wrecked fortifications was the signal the company commander, Captain M.C. Comas, needed. The psychological impact on the pinned-down Marines was electric. Where moments before there had been only despair and the vision of certain death, now there was a gap, a breach in the enemy's wall. M.C. Comas didn't hesitate. He rose from his command post, waving his arm forward. "Now, move up. Follow Williams' path," he bellowed. What happened next was a cascade of regained initiative. The entire company, infused with a surge of adrenaline and hope, rose as one and began to advance rapidly across the ground that had been a killing zone. They moved in bounds, fire teams providing mutual support, but the resistance was fractured, uncoordinated. The interlocking field of fire was broken. Williams, seeing his comrades advancing, transformed from a lone attacker into a pointman for the renewed assault. With his nearly empty flamethrower, he and his team began to methodically clear the adjacent trenches and spider holes they had bypassed in their headlong rush against the pillboxes. They used grenades, rifles, and the last dregs of flame to purge the hidden enemy. The tactical turning point was absolute. Within 20 minutes of Williams' initial charge, Company C had not only secured the entire pillbox complex, but had overrun the Japanese frontline trenches behind it. They established a new, consolidated position nearly 300 yards forward of where they had been hopelessly pinned just an hour before. They captured several intact machine guns and a stockpile of ammunition and grenades. Most importantly, they had turned a defensive strongpoint into a foothold for the entire battalion. The flank of the adjacent company, which had also been stalled, was now secure, allowing them to advance in turn. The meat grinder had a tooth broken. The relentless, grinding pressure of the Marine advance, fueled by such individual acts of supreme valor, was what ultimately cracked Kuribayashi's masterpiece of defense. Williams' 30-minute rampage was a microcosm of the entire Iwo Jima battle. Unimaginable personal courage applied with brutal efficiency to solve an insoluble tactical problem. He had not just destroyed 16 enemy positions. He had restored momentum, morale, and the belief that even the most formidable Japanese fortification could be defeated. The immediate aftermath for Corporal Williams was a blur of exhaustion and surreal normalcy amidst the ongoing battle. After being relieved in the new position, he made his way back to the company command post to refuel and rearm. No grand ceremony marked his return. The battle raged on just a few hundred yards north. He was just another grimy, exhausted Marine, though word of his actions had already begun to ripple through the regiment in odd whispers. He would fight on for the remainder of the campaign, surviving the hell of Iwo Jima, until the island was declared secure on March 26, 1945. His actions on February 26 were meticulously documented in after-action reports by his officers, who recognized they had witnessed something extraordinary. The strategic outcome of the Battle of Iwo Jima is well known. A costly victory purchased with over 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 7,000 dead. The Japanese garrison was almost entirely wiped out, with only a little over 200 taken prisoner from an original force of over 21,000. The capture of the airfields proved invaluable, providing emergency landing for over 2,200 B-29s and saving the lives of an estimated 24,000 U.S. airmen. But within this vast, impersonal statistic are countless individual acts that made the victory possible. Herschel Williams' single-handed assault was one of the most consequential. For his valiant devotion to duty and consummate valor, Corporal Herschel Woodrow Williams was recommended for the nation's highest award. On October 5, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. William's legacy extends far beyond the medal. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Battle of Iwo Jima, living until 2022. He carried the weight of the honor with profound humility, dedicating his post-war life to serving veterans, particularly Gold Star families, through the Herschel Woody Williams Medal of Honor Foundation, which established memorials for Gold Star families across the country. His story became a textbook example of the impact a single, determined individual can have on a large-scale battle. In military science courses, his actions are studied as the perfect execution of the principle of audacity and the critical use of specialized weapons in reducing fortified points. The significance of those 30 minutes on February 26, 1945, is multifaceted. Tactically, it was a masterclass in overcoming a positional defense. Psychologically, it demonstrated that the seemingly invincible Japanese pillbox could be defeated, not by impersonal machinery, but by the raw, terrifying courage of a man willing to walk into its fire. It underscored the vital importance of the flamethrower in the Pacific theater, a weapon of horror, but also of salvation for the infantryman pinned down by concrete. And in a human sense, it stands as one of the purest examples of the Marine Corps ethos. The idea that one Marine, armed with nothing but his weapon, his training, and an indomitable spirit, can change the course of a battle. Herschel Woody Williams did not see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a Marine doing his job, a man trying to protect the comrades on his left and right. But in doing that job with such unmatched ferocity and effectiveness against impossible odds, he entered the realm of legend. The 16 bunkers that fell in 30 minutes were more than just military objectives destroyed. They were a testament to the fact that even in the most mechanized, total war, the heart of a single soldier could be the decisive weapon. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to War Legend Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.